Hello to my third grade class and anyone else that would like to listen to Roald Dahl's sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. This sequel is called Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. And today we will be talking about similes in chapter 1 of this book. Roald Dahl is a master of really describing his characters and the events, and he uses similes quite a bit. The dedication page to this book says that it is dedicated to his daughters Tessa, Ophelia, Lucy, and also for his godson Edmund Pollinger. This is a Puffin's book, that is the publisher, and a lot of children's publishers right now are given permission for teachers to read aloud their books during the school closings. So we're going to start with chapter 1, and we'll be stopping at a couple similes, and maybe you'll be able to think of some at home too, and maybe you'll even find some in your reading. Chapter 1 is called Mr. Wonka Goes Too Far, and my class has just finished reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, so this is a perfect place to start off in our sequel. Chapter 1, Mr. Wonka Goes Too Far. The last time we saw Charlie, he was riding high above his hometown in the great glass elevator. Only a short while before, Mr. Wonka had told him that the whole gigantic, fabulous chocolate factory was his. And now our small friend was returning in triumph with his entire family to take over. The passengers in the elevator, just to remind you, were Charlie Bucket, our hero, Mr. Willy Wonka, chocolate maker extraordinary, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's father and mother, Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine, Mr. Bucket's father and mother, Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina, Mr. Bucket's father and mother. Grandma Josephine, Grandma Georgina, and Grandpa George were still in bed, the bed having been pushed on board just before takeoff. Grandpa Joe, as you remember, had gotten out of bed to go around the chocolate factory with Charlie. The great glass elevator was 1,000 feet up and cruising nicely. The sky was a brilliant blue. Everybody on board was wildly excited at the thought of going to live in the famous chocolate factory. Grandpa Joe was singing, Charlie was jumping up and down, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket were smiling for the first time in years, and the three old ones in the bed were grinning at one another with pink toothless gums. And here's a picture of them all. I know we love the sketches that Quentin Blake does for Roald Dahl's pictures. "What in the world keeps this thing up in the air?" croaked Grandma Josephine. "Skyhooks," said Mr. Wonka. "You amaze me," said Grandma Josephine. "Dear lady," said Mr. Wonka, "you are new to the scene. When you have been with us a little longer, nothing will amaze you." "These skyhooks," said Grandma Josephine, "I assume one end is hooked onto this contraption we're riding in, right?" "Right," said Mr. Wonka. "What's the other end hooked onto?" said Grandma Josephine. "Every day," said Mr. Wonka, "I get deafer and deafer. Remind me, please, to call up my ear doctor the moment we get back." "Charlie," said Grandma Josephine, "I don't think I trust this gentleman very much." "Nor do I," said Grandma Georgina. "He fiddles around." Charlie leaned over the bed and whispered to the two old women. "Please," he said, "don't spoil everything. Mr. Wonka is a fantastic man. He's my friend. I love him." "Charlie's right," whispered Grandpa Joe, joining the group. "Now you be quiet, Josie, and don't make trouble." "We must hurry," said Mr. Wonka. "We have so much time and so little to do." "No, wait. Strike that. Reverse it. Thank you. Now, back to the factory," he cried, clapping his hands once and springing 2 feet into the air with 2 feet. "Back we fly to the factory, but we must go up before we can come down. We must go higher and higher." "What did I tell you?" said Grandma Josephine. "The man's cracked." "Be quiet, Josie," said Grandpa Joe. "Mr. Wonka knows exactly what he's doing." "He's cracked as a crab," said Grandma Georgina. "We must go higher," said Mr. Wonka. "We must go tremendously high. Hold on to your stomachs." He pressed a brown button. The elevator shuddered, and then, with a fearful whooshing noise, it shot vertically upward like a rocket. Everybody clutched hold of everybody else, and as the great machine gathered speed, the rushing, whooshing sound of the wind outside grew louder and louder and shriller until it became a piercing shriek, and you had to yell to make yourself heard. Now, I'd like to stop there for a minute because Roald Dahl just used 2 similes. I know this word looks like smile. We've talked about that before, but it's the word simile, and it's a literary device that makes a comparison between 2 things. And when you use a simile, you use the word like or as in your comparison. Now, when Grandma Georgina said he's cracked as a crab, she was comparing his nutsy behavior with that of a crab. So she's saying he's cracked as a crab. And then you see her using the word as in her simile. Later on, the narrator says that the elevator shuddered, and then with a fearful whooshing noise, it shot vertically upward like a rocket. So they're comparing the elevator's swift movement to that of a rocket. And there you see the word like being used in the simile. So the elevator shot vertically upward like a rocket. So thinking about that, you can start to think about maybe some similes that you would like to think about and write at home. For instance, here we have as playful as a kitten. So there you're using the word as, and you think about how kittens are really playful, and if somebody's really good-natured and playful, you might say they're playful as a kitten or playful just like a kitten. Here we have another one. This pizza is as cold as ice. There's the word as again. You're comparing the pizza to ice. As tall as a giraffe. And we know we have some people in our class like that. As quiet as a mouse. And you could use like too, like their movements were as quiet like a mouse. As timid as a rabbit, as graceful as a swan. And I know we have some dancers in our class that are as graceful as a swan. And as I said, similes can use the word like or as. Here's a simile that uses the word like. We're like 2 peas in a pod, and that can be used to explain or describe a lot of friendships that we have in our class and how you feel about your bestie. So here you're saying, you know, peas are very close together, packed into a pod, and that's how besties feel sometimes. So if you would like to write a couple similes and even illustrate them and send them to me, we could post those in our class email. That would be cool if your parents give permission. But as you can see, Roald Dahl uses similes quite a bit, and he's going to use another one on the next page. So let's keep going with our story. Let's see. Everyone clutched hold of everyone else as the great machine gathered speed. The rushing, whooshing sound of the wind outside grew louder and shriller until it became a piercing shriek, and you had to yell to make yourself heard. "Stop!" yelled Grandma Josephine. "Joe, you make him stop. I want to get off." "Save us!" yelled Grandma Georgina. "Go down!" yelled Grandpa George. "No, no," Mr. Wonka yelled back. "We've got to go up." "But why?" they all shouted at once. "Why up and not down?" "Because the higher we are when we start coming down, the faster we'll be going when we hit," said Mr. Wonka. "We've got to be going at an absolutely sizzling speed when we hit." When we hit what? They cried. The factory, of course, answered Mr. Wonka. You must be whackers, said Grandma Josephine. We'll all be pulpified. We'll be scrambled like eggs, said Grandma Georgina. Oh, did you hear it? Another simile using the word like. We'll be scrambled like eggs. So you can just imagine if they hit the factory at a tremendous speed, they're going to be all scrambled up, just like you think of eggs that are scrambled in a pan. We'll be scrambled like eggs, said Grandma Georgina. That, said Mr. Wonka, is a chance we shall have to take. You're joking, said Grandma Josephine. Tell us you're joking. Madam, said Mr. Wonka, I never joke. Oh, my dears, cried Grandma Georgina, we'll be licktivated, every one of us. More than likely, said Mr. Wonka. Grandma Josephine screamed and disappeared under the bedclothes. Grandma Georgina clutched Grandpa George so tight he changed shape. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket stood hugging each other, speechless with fright. Only Charlie and Grandpa Joe kept moderately cool. They had traveled a long way with Mr. Wonka and had grown accustomed to surprises. But as the great elevator continued to streak upward, farther and farther away from the earth, even Charlie began to feel a trifle nervous. Mr. Wonka, he yelled above the noise, what I don't understand is why we've got to come down at a terrific speed. My dear boy, Mr. Wonka answered, if we don't come down at a terrific speed, we'll never burst our way back in through the roof of the factory. It's not easy to punch a hole in a roof as strong as that. But there's a hole in it already, said Charlie. We made a hole in it when we came out. Then we shall make another, said Mr. Wonka. 2 holes are better than 1. Any mouse will tell you that. Higher and higher rushed the great glass elevator until soon they could see the countries and oceans of the earth spread out below them like a map. Did you hear it? Another simile. I'll back up and I'll read that again. Higher and higher rushed the great glass elevator until soon they could see the countries and oceans of the earth spread out below them like a map. So you can just imagine how high up they were. And on the next page, I'm going to jump to the next page because there is a little sketch of them being so high up, looking down upon all the continents, and how it just seems like it's a map spread out before them that they may have seen before in a book. So that, I think, is a great simile. It was all very beautiful, but when you're standing on a glass floor looking down, it gives you a nasty feeling. Even Charlie was beginning to feel frightened now. He hung on tightly to Grandpa Joe's hand and looked up anxiously into the old man's face. I'm scared, Grandpa, he said. Grandpa Joe put an arm around Charlie's shoulders and held him close. So am I, Charlie, he said. Now, I don't know if you're stopping and thinking about how you would feel, but I get motion sick in cars a lot. Heights, I'm not great with, so I know that I would be scared. I'd probably, be looking for a barf bag around now. Mr. Wonka, Charlie shouted. Don't you think this is about high enough? Very nearly, Mr. Wonka answered, but not quite. Don't talk to me now, please. Don't disturb me. I must watch things very carefully at this stage. Split-second timing, my boy. That's what it's got to be. You see this green button? I must press it exactly at the right instant. If I'm just a half a second late, then we'll go too high. What happens if we go too high? Asked Grandpa Joe. Do please stop talking and let me concentrate, Mr. Wonka said. At that precise moment, Grandma Josephine poked her head out from under the sheets and peered over the edge of the bed. Through the glass floor, she saw the entire continent of North America, nearly 200 miles below, and looking no bigger than a piece of candy. Someone's got to stop this maniac, she screeched, and she shot out a wrinkled old hand and grabbed Mr. Wonka by the coattails and yanked him backward onto the bed. "No, no," cried Mr. Wonka, struggling to free himself. "Let me go. I have things to see. Don't disturb the pilot." "You madman," shrieked Grandma Josephine, shaking Mr. Wonka so fast that his head became a blur. "You get us back home this instant." "Let me go," cried Mr. Wonka. "I've got to press that button or we'll go too high. Let me go, let me go." But Grandma Josephine hung on. "Charlie," shouted Mr. Wonka, "press the button, the green one, quick, quick, quick." Charlie leaped across the elevator and banged his thumb down on the green button. But as he did so, the elevator gave a mighty groan and rolled over onto its side, and rushing, whooshing noise stopped altogether, and an eerie silence took its place. "Too late," cried Mr. Wonka. "Oh my goodness me, we're cooked." As he spoke, the bed with the 3 old ones in it and Mr. Wonka on top lifted gently off the floor and hung suspended in midair. Charlie and Grandpa Joe and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket also floated upward, so that in a twink the entire company, as well as the bed, were floating around like balloons inside the great glass elevator. Oh, I didn't even notice this before the first time I read it, but there's another simile. The people were floating around in the elevator like balloons. And here's a little illustration of them floating around the elevator, just like a lot of balloons would be doing. Let's see. Mr. Wonka on top lifted gently off the floor and hung suspended in midair. Charlie and Grandpa Joe and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket also floated upward, so that in a twink of the entire company, as well as the bed, were floating around like balloons inside the great glass elevator. "Now look what you've done," said Mr. Wonka, floating about. "What happened?" Grandma Josephine called out. She had floated clear of the bed and was hovering near the ceiling in her nightshirt. "Did we go too far?" Charlie asked. "Too far?" cried Mr. Wonka. "I'll say we went too far. You know where we've gone, my friends? We've gone into orbit." They gaped. They gasped. They stared. They, too, were flabbergasted to speak. "We are now rushing around the earth at 17,000 miles an hour, Mr. Wonka said. "How does that grab you?" "I'm choking," gasped Grandma Georgina. "I can't breathe." "Of course you can't," said Mr. Wonka. "There's no air up here." He sort of swam across the ceiling to the button marked oxygen. He pressed it. "You'll be all right now," he said. "Breathe away." "This is the queerest feeling," Charlie said, swimming about. "I feel like a bubble." Oh my gosh, another simile. He feels like a bubble. "It's great," said Grandpa Joe. "It feels as though I don't weigh anything at all." "You don't," said Mr. Wonka. "None of us weighs anything, not even 1 ounce." "What piffle," said Grandma Georgina. "I weigh 87 pounds exactly." "Not now you don't," said Mr. Wonka. "You are completely weightless." The 3 old ones, Grandpa George, Grandma Georgina, and Grandma Josephine, were trying frantically to get back into the bed, but without success. The bed was floating in and in midair. They, of course, were also floating. And every time they got above the bed and tried to lie down, they simply floated up out of it. Charlie and Grandpa Joe were hooting with laughter. "What's so funny?" said Grandma Josephine. "We've got you out of bed at last," said Grandpa Joe. "Shut up and help us back," snapped Grandma Josephine. "Forget it," said Mr. Wonka. "You'll never stay down. Just keep floating around and be happy." "The man's a madman," cried Grandma Georgina. "Watch out, I say, or he'll lixivate the lot of us." Now, I have to admit, that word lixivate was mentioned twice, and I thought it was kind of like liquid, turning to liquid or something. So I Googled it because I had never really heard that specific word before. And like I said, the word is lixivate. So I looked it up, and the definition is to turn to liquid through vaporization. So, you know, we have talked about evaporation when liquid water turns to a gas through evaporation. So this is similar. The example sentence is, the ice cubes were lixivated by the hair dryer. So you can just imagine that. And when I Googled the word, this picture came up in relation to Roald Dahl, and they're kind of illustrating the word lixivate. So I thought that was kind of neat. So once again, today we've talked about how Roald Dahl uses similes to really make awesome comparisons, to really describe what's going on. Similes use the word like or as. So if you would like to create a simile using like or as, maybe even illustrate it, you can have your parents take a picture and send it to me, and I will send it out to our class via email. And I think it'd be neat to see people's illustrations, and I hope everybody is reading a lot. Let me know what you're reading, and tomorrow I will post another lesson. And tomorrow's chapter 2 is called Space Hotel USA. And once again, we'll have some kind of little mini lesson with it. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.